Right now, welcome again to the program, Ray McGovern. McGovern was an Army intelligence officer in the early 60s and then a CIA analyst for the next 27 years. He is the co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity and works with Tell the Word, the publishing arm of the Ecumenical Church of the Savior in inner city Washington, D.C. He also writes regularly for Consortium News, and we welcome you back to the program. How are you, Mr. McGovern? And we welcome Mr. McGovern back to the program. How are you, sir?
I'm doing fine.
All right. This being the 10th anniversary of meeting you write about in the corruption of the U.S. and British intelligence, that is the Downing Street Minutes and Memo. You have often told me that U.S. intelligence is not what it used to be in terms of they're now fixing the intelligence to justify the policy. Would you explain that and then get into the Downing Street Memo and the significance of this 10th anniversary?
Sure, Chris. It's kind of a long story, but I'll go through it carefully and hopefully not too long. This all has to do with, quote, justifying, end quote, the attack on Iraq. It's very clear from documentary evidence and from slips from people like Tony Blair in formal testimony that in April of 2002, George Bush and Tony Blair decided to make war on Iraq. Tony Blair was in Crawford. You don't do these things by telephone. Tony Blair was visiting, British Prime Minister at the time, visiting Crawford. And it's very clear that they decided, well, we're going to do Iraq, okay? And to do Iraq, they needed to womp up some evidence that, that Iraq was needed to be invaded. Now, George Bush famously wanted to be the first war president of the 21st century, and Tony Blair, we know now, pretty much decided that, well, it sounded good to him. He'd like to be the first war prime minister of the 21st century, and so the deal was made. Now, that's April of 2002. Over the next several months, we know that they were on the horn. They were on the telephone together about once a week. And as Tony Blair thought through this, contemplating the first real major war of aggression since World War II, supreme international crime, I guess he wanted to be sure that this is real, and so he talked to Bush, but there's no substitute, especially since even secure communications can be monitored. There's no substitute for, direct personal contact. And so he told Britain's chief intelligence person, Sir Richard Dearlove, to go to consult with his opposite number, namely George Tenet, head of the CIA, and this was July, so April, May, June, it's about 4 months later, and he said, now you find out, Tenet sees the president every morning, like 6 mornings a week, to present the president's daily brief. Find out if this is real. I mean, Tenet will know. So Tenet initially resisted receiving the head of British intelligence, Sir Richard Dearlove, but finally the White House said, no, see him. And you can see why Tenet resisted it, because he's a very garrulous fellow, and he was afraid that he'd say too much, and indeed he did. Some of the people I know were there. They were not there for the one-on-one conversations in Tenet's own little office, but we know exactly what was said, because minutes were prepared of a meeting 3 days later where Tony Blair called Sir Richard Dearlove to brief all his top national security advisors, the Foreign Secretary, the Minister of Defense, the head of the Army, Navy, all these people, the Attorney General, they were all there, okay? Exactly 14 of them. And the reason we know about this, Chris, and this is really, really interesting, is that some brave soul, despite the incredibly sensitive nature of this briefing and of the minutes, gave it to the London Times, and the Sunday Times published it on May 1st, 2005. So we're talking, a year and a half, well, maybe almost, you do the math, 2005, the meeting was on July 23rd, 2002. Now, what was the report? Well, Sir Richard Dearlove opened by saying, Tenet told me that Bush is determined to unseat Saddam Hussein by military action. And this is a direct quote from the minutes, by the way. By the way, nobody has accused the minutes of being inauthentic. Even the British government recognized that they are the authentic minutes. So Bush has decided to remove Saddam Hussein by military action. The war will be justified by the conjunction of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. Bear in mind, this is after 9/11. And then the crowning sentence, but the intelligence and facts will be shaped around the policy. Actually, the word was fixed. The intelligence and facts will be fixed around the policy. Now, that last sentence, of course, is what grabbed the most of us intelligence analysts, because that's the cardinal sin of intelligence work. You don't fix the intelligence around the policy. You give it to them straight, the policymakers, and if they want to fix it, well, that's something different.
In fact, it's supposed to be the other way around, where the intelligence should drive the policy, right?
Well, that's ideally what's supposed to happen. But they had decided to do a war, and to my great sadness here, the head of the CIA got it into his mind that, hey, the president wants to have a war. It's my job to dredge up, quote, evidence, end quote, whether it's forged or manufactured or whatever, to help him sell the war to Congress. And to my dismay, we watched that all happen. And don't take my word for it. After a 5-year study, the Senate Intelligence Committee, the Intelligence Committee of the Senate concluded that the intelligence used to justify the war on Iraq was uncorroborated and non-existent.
Well, how can we continue to have these wars when all of this stuff is public information? Is the American public, is the Senate, is the House, are we all asleep at the switch?
Well, the interesting thing about that conclusion was that it was a bipartisan conclusion that included Chuck Hagel and one of those lady senators from Maine. So, yeah, it's right out there. Now, for those of your listeners who have not heard this, well, you can chalk that up to the impoverishment that is worked on us by what I call the fawning corporate media. The people who run the media, the people who own these corporations, are exactly the same people who are profiteering. I don't say profiting, I say profiteering from these wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and God help us, I hope not, but Iran as well, if that balloon goes up.
All right, we need to take a break right here. When we come back, that's where I want to go, to see if that balloon is going to go up with all the saber rattling that's going on against Iran. Stay with us for more on KDKA. KDKA Radio News Time, 6:17. Veteran intelligence professional with CIA, 27 years. And before that, an Army intelligence analyst, Ray McGovern, is with us. All of what you say, sir, makes me think, is all of this happening? Again, you were about to talk about Iran, and do you think, and do many of the other professionals in the intelligence community start to think that with all the saber rattling we're doing against Iran, Mr. Romney's recent statements, his aides' recent statements, even Mr. Obama's statements about Iran, make me construe that Iran is next? Is it all happening again, and is it based on faulty intelligence?
Well, the answers to your questions are really important, because the one thing that I think would be disaster for us and for the young men and women who would suffer the ultimate price would be to go to war with Iran. Let me just proceed from what happened after Iraq. Now, after it was exposed as these gentlemen, and I use that kind of as Shakespeare used Brutus is an honorable man. All these folks are honorable men. Well, what happened to them? What happened to the British, for example, that did these things? Well, I mentioned Sir Richard Dearlove. I love these sirs. There was a Sir John Scarlett who furnished a lot of the manufactured intelligence, including a piece that said, Saddam Hussein could launch chemical warfare weapons in 45 minutes of an order to do so. And then there was this other fellow, what's his name here? I'm thinking of, Tenet, of course, but what happened to Dearlove? I have to confess, Chris, that I have this proletarian heritage. Actually, my Irish grandmother had a big thing about sirs, about, Duke this and Duke that.
I can imagine.
And she said, Raymond, she said, sirs, those are part of the upper crust, and if you're going to be working for them, which I was going out to caddy on the golf course when I was 14, she said, you need to know the definition of the upper crust. So I think I know. Sit ye down, and I'll tell you, the upper crust is a bunch of crumbs held together by a lot of dough.
Now, leave it to grandmother to come up with the best definition.
If you remember that, Raymond, you're not going to run into a lot of trouble waltzing around the golf course with these muckety-mucks. And indeed, it was a great privilege to realize that, I was as good as these guys, but I wouldn't be treated the same way. Sir Richard Dearlove, what happened? Well, he was allowed to retire with full honors and became a master of one of the Cambridge University colleges. John Scarlett, who was the head of their CIA and who did the fraudulent dossiers, he was rewarded with the top spy job at their external intelligence service, and he was knighted. He got a knighthood, whatever that means. So, these are guys that George Tenet, he got the Presidential Medal of Freedom from George Bush. So they landed for a very soft landing on their feet. Now, why do I mention all that? Because it's relevant today. Because on the 4th of July, their successor, a fellow named Sir John Sawyers, current head of MI6, which is their external intelligence agency, the equivalent to the CIA, he took it into his head to say, number one, that my intrepid agency, MI6, has been able to foil Iran's intentions to develop a nuclear weapon. They would have a nuclear weapon if it hadn't been for my intrepid folks who foiled that. They would have had a weapon by 2008. Now, as things stand, they're just 2 years away from becoming a nuclear weapons state, says Sir John Sawyers. Now, what's wrong with that? Everything. People have to remember, because it's very seldom seen in the press, that after the debacle of Iraq, where George Tenet cooked the intelligence, or fixed the intelligence to suit the policy, honest leadership came into the analysis part of the CIA in the person of a fellow named Tom Finger, who looked at the estimate on Iran this time, because that was next on the list, and he said, this is garbage. This is a bunch of garbage. What we're going to do is a bottom-up assessment to see what the evidence really is on how far Iran is toward a nuclear weapon. And guess what? They started at the end of 2006, and by November 2007, all 16 agencies of the U.S. government involved in intelligence decided unanimously and with high confidence, quote, that Iran had stopped working on a nuclear weapon at the end of 2003 and had not resumed work on the nuclear weapon.
But we don't hear any. You talked about the media. we don't hear any of this in much of the mainstream media. All we hear is Mr. Obama quoted and Mr. Romney quoted and other people like them quoted about how we're going to stand with Israel and we can't let Iran's nuclear ambitions go forward. I don't understand. What's going on? What am I missing?
Well, you're missing what's the driving force behind all this, and that is Israel would very, very much like to give a very bloody nose to Iran, and the best way to do that is to enlist the U.S. to carry it out, and it worked famously with respect to Iraq. That place is devastated. The ability that Iraq would have had to assist the Palestinians in any of their attempts to secure more freedom is obliterated, just like the economy in Iraq. Now, if Israel can persuade the United States to do the same thing with respect to Iran, well, they will have achieved a real bloody nose for their only real rival in the region. Are the Israelis afraid of a nuclear weapon in Iran's hands? Well, number one, their defense minister agreed with ours in January of this year. Ours, Leon Panetta, said on Face the Nation, sort of apropos of not much else, it was really amazing. All of a sudden he looked up from his notes and he said, "Are the Iranians working on a nuclear weapon?" No.
No.
Really,
I saw that. I couldn't believe it, and not much was made of it either.
No. Well, then, what most people don't know is 10 days later, as Joint Chiefs Chairman Dempsey was preparing to land in Tel Aviv, their defense minister, Ehud Barak, gave an interview to the Army radio, okay? And he was asked, "Do you agree with what the U.S. intelligence assessment is?" And he said, "Yeah." And then the next question, well, tell me, Mr. Defense Minister, once Iran did decide to make a nuclear weapon, how soon could they get one? And Ehud Barak, the Israeli defense minister, said this: "It doesn't really matter." That's the official U.S. translation. It didn't find its way into the mainstream press, but this is what he said. It doesn't really matter because to work on a nuclear weapon, the Iranians would have to throw out the UN inspectors. That's precisely why they haven't thrown out the UN inspectors, because if and when they do, then we'll know they're probably working on a nuclear weapon. So when that happens, please come back and ask me that same question, and I'll give you up-to-date answer as to a good guess as to how far they might be from actually producing a nuclear weapon. But until then, okay.
But Americans must feel as though they're being led by sheep, like sheep by Judas goat somewhere, as we talk about more and more war. I think about what's happened in Libya, a nation that had a very high literacy rate, and now we don't hear anything else about what's happened to those sub-Saharan Africans there and the kind of retribution that's going on and how that country was displaced. And I'm not cheering for their former leader or anything, but it just seems to me we go around the world stomping mud holes in people's chests in order to advance our and Israel's foreign policy.
Well, that's the way it seems to an impartial observer. But to get that analysis into the mainstream media is something that is very difficult to do. What we hear from the mainstream media are things like, the Iranian leaders threatened to wipe Israel off the map, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we say, well, no, that's not right. Oh, well, then the comeback is, but the president said so. But President Obama was either misinformed or he was lying because the Iranians never said that. Now,
all right, let me interrupt you. I have to take these commercial breaks on time, but hold that thought if you would, because I want you to pick that up. That's a very important point. I hear it quoted to me by people I interview all the time. Stay with us for more on KDKA with Ray McGovern. We continue our conversation with Ray McGovern, 27-year veteran of the CIA, an intelligence analyst, used to provide the daily briefing for President Bush about what was going on in the world. We're talking to him about how a lot of American intelligence now is is fixed to fit the policy, and how gullible some of us are about understanding that. Mr. McGovern, you were about to make a point about all of this.
Yes, most Americans believe that Ahmadinejad threatened to wipe Israel off the map. That's a lie. And people should know it's a lie, because right off the bat, people got the original Arabic, or original Persian, I should say in this case. And what the phrase was that Ahmadinejad used was, the regime in Jerusalem is destined to disappear from the pages of history. Okay? A rhetorical kind of thing that Khomeini used to say about the Soviet Union. And, of course, Khomeini turned out to be right. Okay? So there's no threat that Iran intends to wipe Israel off the map. No intent either that they would use whatever weapons they have, God forbid a nuclear weapon, to do that. And so this is sort of like an urban legend that keeps getting reinforced. Now, I'm embarrassed to say that part of the fault is due to the President of the United States, who caters to the Israel lobby to the point of repeating these lies. Indeed, on March 4th, as he addressed AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, he repeated this. I can understand why Israel would be so upset because Iran has threatened to wipe Israel off the map. Now, Obama knows that didn't happen. And, most of us were relying on the accurate translation. Even the New York Times and the Washington Post have conceded that wiping Israel off the map is not the right translation. But guess what? Now we have a prominent Iranian official admitting that they never said that. Okay, now who is this? This is their vice premier, okay? His name is Meridor, Dan Meridor. And in an interview on April 14th, he said, okay, all right, so no Iranians ever said we'll wipe Israel off the map. Okay, all right. So you've got the Iranians and the people who know what the translation really is saying this never happened. So why would people keep lying about this, to include the President of the United States? Well, because that's a way to get all the votes he possibly can from those people who think that they're securing Israel by telling these lies. In reality, they're making things much more difficult for Israel to survive. And don't believe McGovern on that. Their previous CIA director, the Mossad director, his name is Meir Dagan. He said less than a year ago that Israel is now in the most weak and vulnerable strategic position of its existence.
But why do we remain, the United States, slavishly tied to Israel's existence and or foreign policy, no matter whom is president? I hear Mr. Romney and his aides making similar remarks. You've written about President Obama. You just spoke about him, how he caves to the Israel lobby. Why is AIPAC so powerful? I mean, I can think of the USS Liberty. I think of so many incidents. The young lady from Olympia, Washington, Rachel Corey, who was, I've interviewed her parents about this. No matter what happens, it seems as though America marches in lockstep with a power that treats some of its own citizens in a manner of apartheid to me. And it's very difficult to say these things in a public forum like we are now without being accused of being anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm. Well, the advantage that I enjoy, and perhaps you as well, Chris, is that we're pledged to tell the truth no matter what, and we're not running for anything, and we don't need any extra money. At least I don't. I'm satisfied with what I have. I don't know what a millionaire does with the second million, to tell you the truth.
I've often asked that question of millionaires and dictators alike. How do you need another palace, huh?
Well, you mentioned lockstep, and that's exactly what it is. And this is not any pejorative comment on Obama. That's his word. I don't know if you remember, but before the Super Bowl, he said, we are going to march in lockstep with Israel. Now, some of your listeners might know what that really means, but for those who don't, that goes back to the late 19th century experience in the South, where people in prison gangs were chained to one another with the chains running over their right shoulders, and the balls were joined to their ankles on their left foot. And so the only way they could move forward was to take a step with their right foot and the chain in lockstep with the person in front, and then drag the left foot with the ball up the couple of feet. So that's what marching in lockstep is. Now, that's what the president said in February during that 4-minute interview before the Super Bowl game. Now, before AIPAC, the speech that I mentioned, I think, is March 4th of the same year. No, March 4th, before AIPAC. He went even further, and he said, I've got Israel's back, okay? Now, put the two images together, okay? I've told you what lockstep looks like, and he says he's got Israel's back. Now, who's leading there? I mean, who's marching in front?
It sounds like we're in shackles here in America to me.
And who's chained and swinging the ball behind Israel? I mean, it's almost a metaphor for the situation that exists. Now, why is that important? It's important because Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, has the initiative here. What he thinks is this: if he can give Iran a really bloody nose, devastate it just as Iraq has been devastated, so that it can no longer give the support it gives to the Palestinians, to Hezbollah, and to Hamas, then, that would be a really good thing. Now, how does he do that? Well, he gets the Americans in a position where, with just 4 months or so before the election, Obama is scared to death that he will seem less behind Israel than Romney. Okay? So what do you do? Well, one thing you could do is provoke an incident in the Persian Gulf, which is cluttered now with UK and US warships and, hundreds of little PT boats with torpedoes on them with Iranian colors on them. Okay? All that has to happen is a provocation of some kind or another, and the balloon will go up.
You expect a false flag attack or something like that?
Well, we know that when Cy Hirsch reported years ago that Dick Cheney had these plans to color or to paint PT boats, fast boats, with Iranian colors, stick them in the Persian Gulf, and have them take out the U.S. destroyer or something like that.
No shades of the Maddox and the Gulf of Tonkin and so many other things that have happened in our history. Remember the Maine? I don't know if we'll ever learn. I really don't.
Very often running. Now, the other thing, and that's bad enough right now, partly because, Chris, people don't know that there's no way the U.S. Navy has to communicate with Iranian naval officials on the scene. Some of us have been urging on the president to create a hotline or a protocol on incidents at sea. All of these things serve a very constructive purpose in preventing any accident or any provocation from spiraling out of control.
They did that with the red phone in the Cold War, didn't they?
That's exactly right. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I was in Moscow in May of 1972 when we concluded an incidents at sea agreement with the Soviet Union, and that really prevented some of these incidents that were already happening mostly close to Soviet shores from spiraling out of control. So that's one thing, that kind of possibility. Now, the other thing is Netanyahu, well, let me just say it, he's lying through his teeth, okay? Why do I say that? Well, when that incident, that terrible terrorist incident happened in Bulgaria, it was minutes later that he said, I know, Iran and Hezbollah were responsible. I know, okay? But then he gets himself onto Fox News Sunday and Face the Nation last Sunday, and he says, I know this because we have excellent intelligence about this. The intelligence is unquestionable, and on Fox News Sunday, he says it's rock-solid intelligence. And Chris Wallace says, well, have you shared that with anybody? And he says, oh, yes, with all the appropriate foreign agencies, okay? Now, what's wrong with that? During this past week, so in the days following those assertions, John Brennan, the counterterrorist guy in the White House, went over to Bulgaria and to Israel, and in each place, he says, we don't know who the perpetrators were. The evidence is not conclusive, and we need to reserve judgment because we don't know, okay? Well, how do you square those two things? Here, Netanyahu says he knows for sure it's rock-solid intelligence. And, well, did he forget to give it to the CIA? Or did it fall in the cracks? Or did the CIA forget to give that to the White House? Give me a break. There is no rock-solid evidence, and he should be called on that.
Well, why is our own Navy rushing U.S. submersibles and unmanned submarines and stuff to the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf to oppose Iran if all of that is untrue?
Well, because that makes good politics. Obama can say, look, we only had 18 ships in the Persian Gulf. Now, under my command, we have 36 ships.
So I'm going to be tough on Iran and any other would-be terrorists, right?
Yeah, right, these terrorists. So, getting back to the Downing Street memo, some of your listeners may recall that the reason that they were going to adduce for going to war with Iraq was, quote, the conjunction of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, quote, okay? Now, what Netanyahu was very artfully doing on Fox News Sunday and Meet the Press was saying, are you going to countenance the prospect that this kind of sponsor of terrorism, Iran and Hezbollah, could get a nuclear weapon?
The fear factor seems to play heavily into this.
Yeah, because they might give these nuclear weapons to these terrorists, and then where would we?
That'll scare everybody to death, and we better take action before they do, right? All right, I have to take this break. When we come back, I do want to let a couple of callers in, okay?
That'd be great.
All right, hold on. Ray McGovern is our guest. We only have a short time with him. Let's go to the phones right now, and we'll go all the way to St. Louis. Paul, you're on KDKA.
Oh, hi, Chris and Ray. Great honor to ask you a couple of questions. A couple of weeks ago, there was a scandal that emerged called LIBOR, and I wonder, in what you're describing, this trap that we're all in, is LIBOR a part of that big picture? They're creating fake collateral, and we're dancing to their tune?
Well, Paul, thanks for the question. This kind of scandal is really beyond my ken, but I would simply comment that it's part of the widespread corruption. As I understand that they were fixing the interest rates to enrich their own pockets. So I would go back to what my grandmother said about the muckety-mucks that represent the upper crust. They don't really care about the rest of us as long as they're enriching their own pockets. And unfortunately, the people in control of our country are susceptible to all manner of influence from these muckety-mucks.
Okay. Well, just to let you know, this LIBOR is apparently kind of a currency exchange in London, and the participants in it were essentially giving each other more credit than they were due and billing it all to the taxpayers, billing it all to the nations.
Yeah, we're familiar with it, but what's the question or point? Does it have to do with intelligence and war and rumors of war? That's our subject.
Yeah, I heard him talking about, both of you talking about the reason why Obama seems to be trapped by these scoundrels. And to give you an example with Fukushima, TEPCO is the owner of the nuclear plants in Japan, and they were considered one of the best blue chip stocks in the world. Not just in Japan, but best blue chip in the world. So when they lost 84% of their value after the nuclear meltdowns, those old boys got panicky. They lost 84% of a blue chip stock, and they were essentially doing super insurance fraud, denying the public the right to learn what really happened, denying the nation the right to learn what really happened. And so the same they're trying to recoup their losses, obviously, but they're also trying to lock us into bad financial advice. And the more we ignore the peril, the more we look like damn fools, and the more our credit rating falls. So it's kind of a nasty spiral of censored news and an ill-informed public.
I don't think any of us would argue with anything that you're saying. It just simply is not the subject, and I don't see you tying it into what we're talking about.
Well, it's just kind of this whirlpool that's dragging us all down.
No doubt about that. All right, thank you for your call. Appreciate you listening in St. Louis. Let's go to Cynthia in Georgia. Cynthia, you're on KDKA.
Hi, Chris.
Hi.
And hi, Ray. I'm so glad to hear you and to know you're still with us in seemingly good health. I'm so glad you mentioned Bulgaria. When I heard this, I thought this is just nonsense. And I think to two authors who have written two books, Patrick Seal, Abu Nidal, A Gun for Hire, how these terrorists were in the employ of the Mossad, whether they know it or not. And Ari Ben Manish, he was the IDF arms dealer. Do you remember him? He wrote a book, Prophets of War. They engineered the Achille Lauro hijacking and killing the poor Leon Klinghoffer. So when these kinds of things happen, I keep looking back to the same cast of characters. And Benjamin Netanyahu, you mentioned him. I think his brother was killed in Entebbe. The British intelligence think that Israel had something to do with the assault in Entebbe. Mm-hmm. So now I'm watching the Olympics, and I am scared, waiting for something to happen to try to make Mitt Romney look credible, to make Benjamin Netanyahu look credible, and to create another incident to attack somebody else that we hate. So that's all I need to say. But thank you again, Chris, and again, Ray. It was very wonderful to listen to you.
All right, thank you, Cynthia.
Bye-bye.
Welcome.
Mr. McGovern?
Well, I just say that the motto of Mossad is victory via deceit. So I too am I'm on tenterhooks here watching the Olympics because it's not too long ago that we had the violence and those terrorist attacks. And if they come this year, I think we have to take very, very close look at who actually is behind them.
All right. From the Dollar Bank Instant Access Center, Adam in the South Hills writes, Chris, I like the red phone idea a lot, but even that is not perfect. One must really understand each other's cultures first and foremost. I found my runny-nosed self in Moscow 1983 through 1984-ish when during the press corps roasting of President Reagan, he quipped, quote, I'm sick and tired of the Russians pounding their chest. The first missiles go in 5 minutes, end of quote. Point is, the military-industrial complex will get us so close that passing gas will set things off. We need to back some things up, trust but verify, but to put the sabers back in the sheaves and hammer this out. As always, great show. By the way, I did order you a copy of the Marine Band's performance, Still Waiting. All right, thank you. This is a Marine. There are no former Marines. This is a Marine writing this, Adam in the South Hills. What do you say, Mr. McGovern?
Well, he mentioned Russia, of course. I was there as well. The only thing I'll say about this is that for the first time in many years, there is the real potential of a clash with Russia. It has to do with Syria. The Russians are a little tired of us mucking around in their near frontier area. They have supported Assad in Syria, and look on what we are doing together with the Turks and, of all people, the Saudis and others and the Israelis as, kind of an illegitimate way to overthrow a government. However atrocious the government is, it's a legally constituted government. And for us to be doing what we're doing is getting a considerable ire on the part of the Russians.
Haven't they and the Chinese also cooperated with the Iranians with those sunburned supersonic missiles? And what happens if they shoot one of those from that the Gulf there, where it's like operating an aircraft carrier is like being in a big lake? If they burn an aircraft carrier to the a water line, there'll be sensible voices won't even be heard. Yours and mine won't even be heard if that happens.
Yeah, and some people would just as soon have that happen. That's a terrible thing to say.
Yeah, it is. All right, let me get one more call in here, and we'll get your final thoughts. Jim in Beaver, hello, quickly, please.
Oh, yes. I just wanted to thank you for the guest. It's very informative, and I think he should run for president. This is the first time I've ever heard anybody actually explain what was going on.
All right.
I want to thank you very much. Excellent guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. We've got a couple of minutes left, and we give them to you, Mr. McGovern, to talk about what we should do as American citizens.
Okay. Thanks, Jim, by the way. Let me just say this, that American people need to know that their sons and daughters, and for the most part, these are sons and daughters from the inner cities and the small towns of our country of less than 50,000 people, that they're likely to be sacrificed to the policy of Israel in the Near East. Iran poses no threat at all to the United States. Hillary Clinton has said precisely that. She adds that Iran does pose a threat to our allies. Now, let me say a thing about allies. Is Israel an ally of the United States? Most people would say, of course it is. It's every day in the press. The answer is no. Look in your Funkin' Wagnalls or your Websters, okay? The definition of an ally is a country with whom your country has a mutual defense treaty. There is none between the United States and Israel, and so the notion that's so widespread that if Israel got in trouble with Iran, that we would automatically have to spring to its aid, that's nonsense. Now, there's more background here. After the Arabs did attack Israel, and that was in 1973, they really actually did do that. The Israelis repulsed the attack very handily, of course, but we went to the Israelis, that is the United States government under Kissinger, and we said, maybe the best thing to prevent that kind of thing from happening again is a mutual defense treaty.
Did we ever sign it? Did we ever sign one?
And guess what? The
No.
Israelis said, well, thank you very much. That's very thoughtful of you, but no thanks.
Wow.
Now,
Mr. McGovern, I'm afraid we're out of time. Quickly, is there a website where we can read your writings?
Sure, RayMcGovern.com.
All right. We really appreciate you coming on our program. I hope to talk to you again in the near future, sir.
Most welcome.
All right. Bye-bye.
President of the 21st century. And Tony Blair, we know now, pretty much decided that, well, it sounded good to him. He'd like to be the first war prime minister of the 21st century. And so the deal was made. Now, that's April of 2002. Over the next several months, we know that they were on the horn. They were on the telephone together about once a week. And as Tony Blair thought through this, contemplating the first real major war of aggression since World War II, supreme international crime, I guess he wanted to be sure that this is real, And so he talked to Bush, but there's no substitute, especially since even secure communications can be monitored. There's no substitute for, direct personal contact. And so he told Britain's chief intelligence person, Sir Richard Dearlove, to go to consult with his opposite.
Right now, welcome again to the program, Ray McGovern. McGovern was an Army intelligence officer in the early 60s and then a CIA analyst for the next 27 years. He is the co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity and works with Tell the Word, the publishing arm of the Ecumenical Church of the Savior in inner city Washington, D.C. He also writes regularly for Consortium News, and we welcome you back to the program. How are you, Mr. McGovern? And we welcome Mr. McGovern back to the program. How are you, sir?
I'm doing fine.
All right. This being the 10th anniversary of meeting you write about in the corruption of the U.S. and British intelligence, that is the Downing Street Minutes and Memo. You have often told me that U.S. intelligence is not what it used to be in terms of they're now fixing the intelligence to justify the policy. Would you explain that and then get into the Downing Street Memo and the significance of this 10th anniversary?
Sure, Chris. it's kind of a long story, but I'll go through it carefully and hopefully not too long. This all has to do with, quote, justifying, end quote, the attack on Iraq. It's very clear from documentary evidence and from slips from people like Tony Blair in formal testimony that in April of 2002, George Bush and Tony Blair decided to make war on Iraq. Tony Blair was in Crawford. You don't do these things by telephone. Tony Blair was visiting, British Prime Minister at the time, visiting Crawford. And it's very clear that they decided, well, we're going to do Iraq, okay? And to do Iraq, they needed to womp up some evidence that, that Iraq was needed to be invaded. Now, George Bush famously wanted to be the first war number, namely George Tenet, head of the CIA, and this was July, so April, May, June, it's about 4 months later. And he said, now you find out, Tenet sees the president every morning, like 6 mornings a week, to present the president's daily brief. Find out if this is real. I mean, Tenet will know. So Tenet initially resisted receiving the head of British intelligence, Sir Richard Dearlove, but finally the White House said, no, see him. And you can see why Tenet resisted it, because he's a very garrulous fellow, and he was afraid that he'd say too much, and indeed he did. Some of the people I know were there. They were not there for the one-on-one conversations in Tenet's own little office, but we know exactly what was said because minutes were prepared of a meeting 3 days later where Tony Blair called Sir Richard Dearlove to brief all his top national security advisors, the Foreign Secretary, the Minister of Defense, the head of the Army, Navy, all these people, the Attorney General, they were all there, okay? Exactly 14 of them. And the reason we know about this, Chris, and this is really, really interesting, is that some brave soul, despite the incredibly sensitive nature of this briefing and of the minutes, gave it to the London Times, and the Sunday Times published it on May 1st, 2005. So we're talking, a year and a half, maybe almost, you do the math, 2005, the meeting was on July 23rd, 2002. Now, what was the report? Well, Sir Richard Dearlove opened by saying, Tenet told me that Bush is determined to unseat Saddam Hussein